Look who it is. It's you watching me. What's going on? This is your host, Madman, and this is video number 3 of the MADCAST series, episode 3. So, in this episode, we're going to talk about language. It's a pretty broad subject. We're going to get even broader, in fact, with it. Because in the context of this video, I'll say this right off the bat, language is almost a euphemism or a synonym for the term pattern. And patterns are, of course, ordered sequences of things or repeated sequences of things. And I want to talk about the effect of these sequences on life and reality and all sorts of big, broad ideas. So this is going to be a hell of a video. I don't know how long this is going to be. This might be a long one, guys. So, I do have my 5 points laid out for this video in a Word document, and we're going to go through them one by one, so this video isn't as much of a disorganized mess as the other two have been, the first two. So my first point about language is, we don't really know what it is. Riveting, I know. Riveting point. I think that, first of all, we don't even know how to define language. Because you can speak or transmit information in so many different ways that it's hard to even pin language or pattern down with a single term. A song or a series of taps on a drum or a painting can convey an emotion or an idea, and that's still information being transferred from one place to another, one source to another. I think that language occupies all these different media. It's not something that's specific to words on a page or to spoken words or to sound or to images. It encompasses all these things. And it also encompasses mathematics, physics, all these types of different patterns that occupy this realm we're in, whatever it is. And it's kind of a moot point to look into language's origins. I mean, really, once you go deep enough, you're looking into like logical axioms, you're looking into laws of physics, things like that, theories about physics. And even if our theories about physics are wrong, the language that we use to interpret the laws of reality is a language. That's my point. I'm not really talking spiritually or metaphorically here about like God or anything. Like God is the Word and the Word was God. Like, sure, maybe. But what I'm more so talking about is the effect of language's presence and how people interpret it and how it moves through human societies. And I have to go back really far to begin that first point about the origins of language. I have to go back to the origins of life, because life, looked at from a biochemical perspective, is a physical incarnation of some kind of series of patterns. DNA is an enciphering of physical substances. It's a knotting of a chain of amino acids into a structure that tells the cells that it's in to produce proteins. It's almost like a parasite. And even if you go back before DNA existed, you have crystalline structures. You have minerals coagulating in regular forms that are fractal. If you go down to the atomic level, the little arrangements of atoms look the same. And then when you zoom out to another level, even a common quartz crystal, you can see the same pattern repeating over and over again. Crystals are kind of like a physical manifestation of a very boring heaven, where every structure is just the same thing repeated over and over again. It's the same hymn to God, sung out into eternity over and over again, if you want to get spiritual about your metaphors. DNA is like this messy, meaty kind of thing, but it's a hell of a lot more complex, and it's a hell of a lot more interesting, because it doesn't just replicate the same pattern over and over again, given the right conditions, which is what crystals do, but it seems to want to constantly change. It wants to be mutative. It wants to be different. And that's where you and I are right now. We're in that realm. We're in the realm of the meat spacesuit, courtesy of DNA. Copyright DNA. The Dyson DNA meat suit. A way of experiencing reality where you can have lots of fun, because every 2 years you're psychologically different. Every 11 years, all your molecules are sorted out into new ones. Isn't that interesting? So I don't think we can really define language. I don't think we can even pin down what it is. All we can do is say, well, there are patterns that predate life, and then there's patterns we can find in life. And we're life looking at itself, which gives us a pretty heavy bias. If you're a scientist, that observer bias is a big problem, even if you're not in quantum physics, where it really starts to be a problem. It's even a problem in, I think, biology and chemistry, because the way you're interpreting these chemical activities that are taking place in your own body while you're interpreting them, that's a whole other issue. But I don't want to get into sort of metaphysics or ontology, for that matter. I'm just talking about language here. So that's basically point number one, is language is this weird thing that seems to be an extension of the laws of physics incarnated in matter. And matter itself is subject to the laws of physics by definition. But, it couldn't exist without those laws. Whether dark energy exists or whether any of these weird theories are true, it doesn't really matter. We have an incomplete picture of things, obviously, because we're human beings. We're meat golems. We have a hard time, looking at our own flesh under a microscope. It's kind of a creepy thing to do. It's difficult. We have all these biases. But even if we didn't have these biases, if we were silicon-based robots, or our brains were in jars, we would still be studying the nature of the jar. We'd still be asking questions about our current way of being embodied. It would still be a series of questions being asked forever. Screaming into the abyss with endless questions. It's not complaints, it's the endless questions, the endless queries of science, which I think overall, science, there's a sort of a cope where people are like, well, it's like any tool. If science is used by evil people, it will be evil. If it's used by good people, it will be good. I think science is a net good. I think that investigating the natural world, even if that investigation gets co-opted every now and then by some tyrant, the act of investigating it is important, because it's our only way of understanding ourselves. And in that fundamental sense, that basic sense, I think science is fundamentally good. I think fire and stone tools are good things. I think that language overall is a good thing, whatever it is. And if science is attempting to understand language and attempting to even try to define it, which I don't think is possible, but it's trying to do that, define it in its many forms, I should clarify, categorize it, divide it up, parse it into different media, different forms. That's not a bad thing. But the actual origin of language is like the origin of the universe. It's a similarly moot question to contemplate, because we will never know the answer. It's more important to figure out what the implications of language are, and to try to use it to better our lives and to elevate ourselves. So that's sort of point one. Pretty well articulated, as best I can. So point two about language, and again, I'm talking about written and spoken language, mathematics, art, architecture, anything that's a series of patterns that's established and then offered to people, offered to people's minds. Language in this video it's a very broadly defined thing. My definition of it in this video is very broad, because language isn't, the same pattern repeating forever, but it is a series of patterns. It's information enciphered. It's the transfer of information through different media. Those are sort of the ways I define language. And I'm playing the role of the philosopher here, guys. I'm sorry if you don't like philosophy videos. I mean, if you don't, why the fuck are you watching this? I mean, go ahead and psychologically profile me all you like. I'm not going to join any of your creepy organizations. I need to be able to say what I'm saying right now without any restrictions, or I won't say it. That's just how it is. So point two. My second point about language is that it seems to be totally pervasive, despite whatever its intentions are or whatever its source is. If language is a manifestation of God's will, if you're a religious person, or if it's an extension of the mathematical laws of physics trying to occupy matter and organize matter in the same way that physical laws are organized, or in a similar way. Either way, whatever the intent or the morality you could assign to the existence of language is, it seems to be pervasive. It seems to be in everything. It's in crystals that precede life. It's in DNA. It's in the orbital patterns of celestial bodies like planets. It's in the laws of physics. You can go right back to the beginning of the universe as we understand it. And language is always there. Language is there either in the form of mathematics and physics, or it's there in some, I guess I have to call language a derivative. I mean, language really is a derivative of mathematics. Even art and architecture, these things rely on mathematics to some extent, but their very existence as media, like the actual invention of speaking to each other, of manipulating the mouth and throat to create sounds that encipher information, and only someone who speaks your language will understand the cipher. That's fundamentally mathematical. Mathematics is the basis for all this. And I'm not a mathematician. I'm very bad at math. I gravitated towards language because that was just my natural affinity. I wanted to study speech and language, and how it functions like a programming language for the human brain, and it tries to both contain and release in a controlled way human emotions. It's a way of it's basically a cope for mathematics and physics finding themselves knotted into a human body. And I don't think that if there's a religious interpretation that's correct, it's not that God is language, it's that God is mathematics. God is the laws of physics. And even if we've misunderstood those laws, that doesn't disprove that point. It doesn't prove it either. But I think that whatever laws this universe functions on, those are the closest things to the thoughts of God or the mind of God. And you can look at different scientists and mathematicians and physicists and theorists that have espoused this type of viewpoint. And in a lot of ways I agree with them. So unfortunately that means, if I agree with that, I'm pretty far away from God if I'm obsessing over language. But language is still a derivative of that. So, here I am. I'm on the doorstep of hell, but I'm not going to go in. I'm just fascinated by how nice the door looks. That Rodin Gates of Hell, it's a hell of a sculpture. It's beautiful. Anyway, enough about the religious metaphor shit. My second point, again, is just language is pervasive. It seems to be in everything. It seems to constitute everything. And we don't know what its intent are, just like we don't know what its origins are, which is my first point. We don't know what its origins or its intent are, but it seems to be everywhere. It seems to be in everything. So, a lot like how Spinoza characterized God as being diffused amongst his creation and sort of dissolved into every living thing. Language seems to be like that. That's why I love Spinoza's writing. If you haven't read Spinoza, my God, read Spinoza. That book had a genuine spiritual impact on me. It was useful to me in my spiritual journey, whatever you want to call it. But Spinoza's thoughts are very fucking solid, and his arguments, despite being spiritual in nature, are relentlessly logical. He writes beautifully about his argument. And I'm just reading an old translation of him from like 1908 or something. New translations are probably better, but in any case, mathematics, written language, patterns, basically order itself, seems to be distributed amongst everything. And again, you can look at things fundamentally in this universe as a battle between order and chaos. That's why I think a lot of people like the 40K universe, is because it's a battle between order and chaos, fundamentally. Because even the alternate forms of order, the Eldari and the Orcs and all these other fantasy races, they're alternate forms of creating order. And there's a battle between those forms on one level, but none of them, except the worshippers of chaos, want chaos to rule. But chaos has to exist for order to exist. There has to be a sort of dichotomy there. But maybe, that's a whole other video on binaries. I want to do a video on like false binaries. That'd be an interesting one to do. It's another idea that haunts my brain, is this idea of separating everything into two camps. And I think that's a result of just the human brain being a two-hemisphere structure, and the body being a symmetrical thing. I think that's a very limited way of looking at reality, as just two competing forces. Red and blue, up and down, black and white, good and evil. That's not to say that some ambiguity is better, or to justify, psychopathic things. But I think that perspective is woefully limited, and we got to do a video about that. That'll probably be the next video. That'll probably be the next one. But anyway, point number 3 is kind of a dark one. Point number 3 about language or pattern or order or math or whatever you want to call it is that in order to persist, it sacrifices the vessels that house it. Whether that's a worm or a bird or a hippo or a person, or a crystal in some cave underground, some sealed off cave. Language seems to constantly sacrifice the material vessels that house it in order to continue its own existence. It seems to not be uncaring, but at least indifferent to its vessels. And that's a very cynical, nihilistic way of viewing order's interaction with chaos. Again, to indulge in like a dualistic worldview, which I don't think is entirely correct. I think there's orders that are chaotic, and there's chaos that has an order to it. I do think that it's not as simple as that. But for the purposes of this discussion about language, let's say it is. Let's say that's right. Let's say reality is just an eternal battle between order and chaos, and order is always ordered and chaos is always chaotic. There's no exceptions. I hate to say that, but let's say it's true. In any case, language is something that occupies matter and transforms it into various forms, and it's almost like language is experimenting with matter to try to find the most viable form that it can persist in. And it's doing a billion or a trillion experiments at once with different forms, different animals, different substances, different planets, whatever you want to call it. It's performing all these experiments all at once in order to find the one most optimal path or most optimal way to reproduce itself, or to at least persist in its own form. And that's creepy. This is where a lot of philosophers and poets who've written about language get creeped out. They're like, well, even me writing this philosophical treatise that I'm writing, it's like I'm being possessed by language. And a mathematician who writes a mathematical treatise is in a sense being possessed by language. But that doesn't imply that if you can go back to monkey, you'll be free of language, because language is in your DNA. It's in your every cell in your body. It's always already, which is a phrase I hate to use, but it's true here. Language has always already constituted you. It's not that it colonized some innocent form and mutated you to follow its diktats. It's that your base form is constituted by language. Language, in a sense, does seem like a god. But if it's a god, I think it's more of a demiurge than a Sophia, to use a Gnostic metaphor. I think that God, if such a being exists, which I think it does, it is beyond language. And that's why it's incomprehensible. That's why we're not going to be able to create definitions for it. We're not going to be able to understand it through metaphor or through math or through any language. The real God, the actual creator, if there is one, is not constituted by language and is not bound by it. But we are. So again, the creepy implication of this is, well, you could view all forms of pattern as hypnotic songs, whether they're musical or not, literally. You know, if it's a way of building things, a way of painting, a certain aesthetic, a certain way of writing itself, these are all persistent, repeating patterns that want to, like living beings, perpetuate themselves, like viruses. And in that sense, they are, like we are, below any conceivable being that is above them. And if we can conceive of something we don't understand, that's sort of what Spinoza argues. I'm mischaracterizing Spinoza in this video. I gotta make a separate video about Spinoza. That's what we gotta do. We gotta do a video about Spinoza. That's another video we have to do. But anyway, the nature of language is that it sacrifices the clay that it occupies, the matter that it's in, to serve its own needs. And your thoughts and your speech, unfortunately, I have to get a bit schizo here, are not only mediated by language, they're actually produced by it. And so is your consciousness. So is my consciousness. I'm making this video right now because language wanted me to. That's what I'm implying with this theory. And this is just a theory. It's just me thinking. I don't believe any of this shit like it's the one true gospel. You got to follow the gospel of language. If you don't, you're a heretic. I'm gonna expel you from my church, motherfucker. It's not what I'm saying. I'm just thinking about ideas. And ideas are powerful. If you actually think about them and allow the idea for just an instant to possess you, if you have the mental will to be unpossessed, you can evaluate the idea for its true merit. And I was blessed or cursed with that gift. I can allow myself to be temporarily possessed by an idea fully, and then pull myself out. You know, it's like that scene from Constantine where Keanu Reeves goes into hell, but just temporarily. Then he pulls himself out. That's kind of what I do. Not to ingratiate myself. Not to be like, I'm Constantine, I'm John Wick, I'm a badass. I'm the furthest thing from a fucking badass that anyone has ever been. Okay? It's not what I'm saying. But anyway, that's point number 3. Language, whether it cares about its vessels or not, We probably can't know that, but it sacrifices them for its own ends. Point number 4, very important point. Language mutates faster than DNA, even if they're both the same thing. So any form of order, ironically, that wants to impose a pattern upon chaos, if that force of order, whether it's a language, whether it's a chemical, a series of chemical actions that allows crystals to exist, whether it's what created DNA, whatever it is, it's not just dependent upon chaos to exist in the first place, because it acts as a mirror to chaos. The really creepy thing is that forms of order that last have to mutate, like chaos. They have to change constantly. And that implies, like John Carpenter's The Thing, that the most enduring form of order would actually look almost exactly like chaos. It would be an amorphous blob. The most persistent, holy, beautiful, perfect form of order would not be something that refused to mutate. It would be something, it wouldn't be something that had figured out all the laws of physics and, I can resist 10 billion gamma rays. No, the most perfect form of order would be one that is a hair's breadth away from chaos. It's so close to chaos, but it refuses to be chaotic, that it embraces constant mutation. So it goes from one form of order to another rapidly, without any hesitation. That's what The Thing from John Carpenter's movie is, and the book that inspired that, it's called Frozen Hell. I forget the author's name, but the idea of an amorphous entity, which is again just a metaphor for life, that responds to chaos by embracing 99% of chaos's behaviors, but leaving that one sliver of a soul intact. That, I think, to me, is the most enduring form of order, because it's an order that understands chaos as much as it can without joining it. It mutates because it knows that chaos is what's setting the rules. Chaos is the base, the foundation of this universe. Random chance and random probability are the basis of this. And again, there's mathematicians, there's chaos theorists and probability mathematicians. My dad was big into probability. He's a mathematician. He's an engineer. He dealt with probabilities. That was his way of confronting chaos. And probabilities are very creepy. It's like looking into the abyss. When you're studying probabilistic math, you're studying not just how people move around in a city, but you're studying the laws that cause them to move that way. And it takes a huge toll, I think, on your mind to study something like that, even if you're a very will-imbued person. So that's basically point 4, is that language, as a force of ordering and patterning, has to respond to chaos by mimicking it to some degree. It has to mutate. And I'm not going to talk about chaos and what its nature is. I have no knowledge about that. But you could argue that, chaos is also trying to mimic order in order to fight it. If we're in some kind of hell dichotomy, which again I think is an oversimplification. I think you can't reduce things to two halves. I think that's a bit too stupid. It's a bit too ape-brained to do that. There's either banana or no banana. There's either sex or no sex, rain or no rain. That seems a bit limited. It's not to say that that way of thinking is doesn't have its utility and isn't useful, but it seems a bit limited to me. I think nuanced thinking is necessary, at least in certain contexts it is. Anyway, let's move on to our final point, point number 5, which is language can either control or enthrall you depending on your willpower. So you can use language as a tool, or language can use you. And inevitably, you'll vacillate between these two roles in your life. There will be times when you allow language to use you intentionally, or it takes over. And there will be times when you use language as a tool for some kind of action or some kind of intent that seems to come from a place that is unbound by language, that seems to come from a place that is not bound by pattern. Does that mean you're being possessed by chaos? Maybe, if you want to use that metaphor of chaos versus order, chaos versus language. But I think in a lot of cases, there's a positive force above language that will allow you to circumvent language's constraints. And I think it's probably the same force, whatever it is. I'm not going to try to define it, not going to religify or unreligify it. But I think it's the same force that lets mathematicians have these epiphanic insights into mathematical equations. It's the same force that seems to sort of sprinkle knowledge on humanity like fairy dust every now and then through certain people. Again, using them like vessels. Language, again, uses us like vessels. That's, I think, fundamentally true. Whether it's good or bad, or whether it's abusive or not, I think it's true. And again, our very bodies are made up of language, of pattern. So if you're not being used by something that isn't related to you, it's you using you, from a sort of meta sense. But I think that there are people who resist impulses to do things, or resist certain ideas that come to them through language, and it turns out to be a good decision. And there's other people who resist those same types of impulses, and it turns out to be a bad decision. But there seems to be a willpower in the human body, the ancient language of DNA, that is communing or communicating with newer forms of language. And on a meta level, again, you could say it's language criticizing itself. It's order trying to buff itself against itself like a whetstone against a sword blade, trying to sharpen itself. Or it's like a better metaphor is a rock tumbler. If any of you know what that is, when you're trying to polish rocks, you throw them all into a little sort of washing machine, miniature washing machine, and they knock against each other until they're all smooth. And often it reveals these beautiful sheens on their surface. It creates the sheen, not reveals it. And it can create very beautiful little objects. And I think language, in a lot of cases, is trying to do that with itself. There's different forms of order trying to rock tumble themselves against each other. And that explains a lot of things. It explains different human societies. It explains different perspectives in societies between groups. And it explains individual differing perspectives, knocking against other perspectives. It explains conversation, dialogue, argument, warfare. It explains a lot of things. But it's just a metaphor. It's not true. But anyway, that's point number 5. So I'm going to end this video here. Maybe this was a bit too expedient. Maybe it was a bit too fast. I don't know. Again, I came up with the 5 points beforehand, so this video wouldn't be a slog of tangents. But I don't care. This is just an experiment. These videos, this whole series of videos is an experiment. And I'm going to keep it going because I enjoy doing it. So, I hope you enjoyed watching. I hope you're doing well in your life. I hope you're being treated well by language. I hope you're treating language well. And As always, peace out.